Yes, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Tarabya Cultural Academy to this afternoon's podium on the state and leaderlessness. My name is Pia Entmann. I'm from Tarabya Cultural Academy, which is the residency where Isaac Chong-Wai has been doing his artist residency since October last year. His project Leaderless is an artistic political campaign that attempts to decentralize the representation of power on one individual and resists the violence of totalitarianism. I will try to guide you through this podium without being too much of an authoritarian moderator, I hope. So later on, the floor is yours, and I hope that you will all participate. First of all, I would like to thank Bilsart and Silbermann for making Isaac's exhibition and the series of podiums possible. Great thanks to Zeynep, and I can also see Evrim here. Thank you so much for this wonderful collaboration. I would like to briefly introduce you to our renowned guests, Ms. Banu Karaca and Mr. Consul General Johannes Regenbrecht, who have very generously accepted the invitation to join the panel and to share their expertise and experience with us today. Banu Karaca is an anthropologist working at the intersection of political anthropology, art, and aesthetics, with a focus on nationalism and cultural policy, museums, and commemorative practices. Some of her recent publications interrogate the politics of intercultural exchange programs in the EU, freedom of expression in the arts, the visualization of gendered memories of war and political violence, and visual literacy. Her book, The National Frame, State Violence and Aesthetic Practice in Turkey and Germany, examines the entrenchment of art and state violence. And as far as I know, it was published just a few days ago. So congratulations, dear Banu, for this great effort. Yeah, there it is. Johannes Regenbrecht is a highly experienced German diplomat. He joined the Federal Foreign Office in 1987. His first posting was in Mexico City. In 2007, he became the head of the Department Central Asia and Southern Caucasus at the Federal Foreign Office. Later on, he was deputy head of mission at the embassy in Seoul, before serving as Ukraine special representative and ambassador and head of the Ukraine task force at the headquarters of the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin until 2016. And in 2017, he became deputy head of mission at the embassy in Beijing, where, as you can all imagine, he was also a witness of the recent developments between Hong Kong and China, which I'm sure will also be very interesting for the discussion today. Since September 2020, Johannes Regenbrecht is Consul General at the German Consulate General in Istanbul. Thank you so much for being here, Banu and Johannes. Both of you suggested to give an introductory statement, but before giving the floor to you, let me ask you two very short questions in order to get an idea of your understanding of the terms leadership, and leaderless. How would each of you, just in a few words, define those notions? And maybe while giving your brief answers, could you also let us know if leaderlessness is always positive for you or always negative? Would you start, Banu?
Sure. I know we are supposed to be short, but I would be remiss not to thank Isaac for the invitation, Pia, you for facilitating this conversation, along with Bilsart and Silbermann for bringing us together. I'm very glad that this is an occasion to, even if only virtually, meet Johannes for the first time and welcome him to Istanbul, although I'm physically not there, but hopefully soon in person. And thank you all for joining at these insane Zoom times that we are all living through these days. As for my introductory remarks, I want to raise one point that I will be coming back to, which is that the lack of leaders does not necessarily, I think, indicate a lack of leadership or the absence of leadership as such. And I think this might be a sort of differentiation that might be important, and that I see Isaac's work also inviting us to think about. Let me also preface my statements by saying that I think it's also important to keep in mind who does the ascription or to a movement or to a sort of phenomenon, a gathering, an assemblage of people as leaderless, because this has become increasingly also a way of describing certain kinds of social movements in order to discredit them, not to take them seriously as well. And as a way of making certain population or sort of delegitimizing certain kind of claims. And finally, I should also say, of course, leaderlessness per se does not automatically translate into more equitable or more just ways of organizing and making political demands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Banu. How about your definitions, Johannes?
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to join Banu in thanking everybody for setting up this great conference. I really would have preferred to have it in real terms, in presence physically, but these times are not so good, and better to do it via Zoom than not to do it. I was very, very happy and glad to be present at the performance and to see the great work Isaac has been done together with the performers. So to your questions, Pia, first, leadership. We Germans have difficulty with the word, with the term of leader, or in German Führer, because this is associated with a ruthless, tyrannical leader associated with the Nazis, with Hitler. Therefore, a German would shy away from the German term at least and prefer to use the English term. On that understanding, I would say a good leader is a person with authority, whose leadership is accepted by the people, and who is able to communicate, and first of all is able to listen, to be silent, to listen to people, to their concerns, to be aware of the others, and to show empathy. On leaderless structures, I very much agree with what Banu had said. It is not per se positive or negative. Certainly, it is a very, very good goal, a very, very good aim to have people acting by themselves as mature adults, assume full responsibility not only on their private affairs, but also on public affairs. But that would mean they would need highly developed skills of communication to take care for common affairs. For example, the distribution of resources such as food, water, electricity, construction of infrastructure. So they would need to get highly well organized. So I would also say that even a leaderless society needs leadership on these issues, needs some distribution of tasks, and needs, I would even say, as a hopefully good bureaucrat, needs some good bureaucracy, but on a very, I would say, horizontal level. And last but not least, these social movements that we have been witnessing for 10 years, leaderless movements, to drop a little bit bitter, or to swallow a bitter pill. We have other movements, for example, white supremacy or Ku Klux Klan in the US, who have been leaderless and all have very, very or highly decentralized structures in the US in order to avoid prosecution, to hide from the authorities and from the police. So you can look to it, have a look to it from different sides. Thanks.
Thank you very much to both of you. Very interesting thoughts. It's especially interesting that you, Johannes, brought up the notion of listening, as the author Gündüz Vassaf, who also contributed to the publication linked to the exhibition, also referred to that we all are supposed to learn how to speak, but never to listen, and that especially leaders are often more learned to speak, but not to listen. So I think this could be a topic that we could discuss in more detail later on. Now, I think we're all very curious to hear your introductory statements, and I thought it would be best if you, Johannes, start from the more like global perspective, from a state perspective, really, being a German diplomat. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pia. Give me might be 7 minutes, 7-8 minutes for 5 points I would like to make. I would summarize these 5 points at the end to have a good basis for the continuation of our discussion. So first point is the following. Globally and internationally, at least in recent history, there has been no leaderless order. If we take a look to the United Nations that were established in 1945, you see the key decision-making organ, which is the Security Council, made up of 15 members, and the 5 permanent members are the 5 victorious nations issued coming out from World War II, which are, of course, the US, Russia, China, UK, and France, who are, I would say, not representative to the current world order. Where are a lot of Asians? Where are the Africans? Where are where's the Latino world? So complete underrepresentation of large parts of the world, but the 5 permanent members reject any attempt at reforming and opening up, so they do not open the club. So after then 45, we had the Cold War, the US versus the Soviet Union. And then we had a very, very brief unipolar moment, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And even, you know, Francis Fukuyama projected the end of history with only the US as the only kind of benevolent hegemon surviving and guiding us through the world. But this unipolar moment is now 30 years after. It seems to be a long time ago. It seemed 300 years ago even, because now we witness a new conflict, mainly between the US and China. So in conclusion, to the first point, I would say a leaderless international order, at least for the time being, is an illusion. A G0 is unrealistic, at least in the close future. My second point, internationally, there is not a lack. We don't have too many leaders, but there is a lack, I would say, of good leaders. We need more good and democratic leaders in order to take forward issues such as public health, so to fight against COVID-19, to overcome the dramatic climate change, to help settle bloody conflicts, to take forward development, to address demographic imbalances, and to help strengthening multilateralism and to overcome the increasing division. We need, my second thesis is the absence of leadership even that we saw during the Trump time, when the US was withdrawing from a lot of international organizations and leaving a lot of space. The absence of leadership will be used by other powers to fill the void, to step into the gap, and to use their influence with the aim of imposing their rules. And frequently we saw authoritarian states to make use of that opportunity. So the absence of good or benevolent leadership comes to the expense of the weaker members of the international community, and not the stronger, because the stronger ones, such as the US or China, they know how can they help themselves, and they put kind of America first or China first. So a leaderless world under the current circumstances would be a risk, or more a risk than an opportunity. And a world without democratic leadership would definitely be a worse and not a better place. Third point, internally within our nations, we witness a dramatic decline of freedom over the past 14 years. In its latest report, the US NGO Freedom House states democracy and pluralism are under assault. In 2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. Individuals in 64 countries experienced deterioration, so worsening of their political rights and civil liberties. Against this background, my third thesis would be key challenges nowadays are the rise of authoritarianism, dysfunctional and disruptive divided democracies, growing division within democracies, and the strengthening of extremist movements on the fringes. Wouldn't it be at this stage too early to advocate a leaderless society instead of asking for leaders or strengthening leadership to fight for democracy, for more democracy and more human rights? Question mark. Fourth point on social movements. We have been witnessing over the past 10 years a strong rise of powerful and efficient leaderless social and protest movements, be it Occupy Wall Street until the protest movements in Hong Kong, beginning from the Arabellion exactly 10 years ago. These are impressive models for decentralized, relatively hierarchy-free, spontaneous, faceless mass movements that challenge autocratic systems and address violations of human rights and liberties. Even though a lot of them failed, such as the Arabellion or the Arabic Spring 10 years ago, they established powerful precedents, give a lot of hope, and they are being imitated by a lot of protest movements in other countries, especially in Zhong Wei's motherland, Hong Kong, where we saw in 2019 an impressive protest movement against mainland China's attempt at ending the one country, two systems rule. Hence, against that background, my fourth thesis would be leaderless protest movements have proven to be very successful, sustainable and efficient, although at the end of the day, not effective when confronted with the overwhelming power of the ruling authorities. Nevertheless, they established a good role model, and it remains to be seen as to whether some of them can be successful. We see something very interesting going on both in Belarus and in Russia. Russia with kind of a hidden leader, Mr. Navalny, in prison. But at the same time, we have to admit that there is also a great risk that these protest movements degenerate into violence or are being used by extremists or criminal elements, which provide a welcome pretext to the state power to crack down and criminalize the whole movement, including the peaceful protesters. So my fifth point would be less a point or a thesis than a question. So would leaderless societies in the future, would they be able to survive in an antagonistic world order? So the dilemma is that the world, even though we have a lot of smaller societies, leaderless, based on values, human rights, democracies, the problem is that the world outside is mostly composed by wolves, egoistic and selfish armed nation states. The European member states took the decision to unite and to transfer power to Brussels in order to strengthen our European sovereignty, so to create a bigger entity to be able to cope, not only to survive, but to be sitting on the table, to participate in taking forward the world order, to be an active actor instead of only reacting. So the question would be, how can we build leadership at the international multilateral level if we would have more leaderless societies? So in summary, let me summarize my 5 points very briefly. First point was G0 is unrealistic, will not happen soon. Second, internationally, we need more, not less, good leadership exercised by democratic states based on universal norms such as democracy, human rights, and individual freedoms. Third, internally, within the nations, we see a dramatic rise of autocratic systems, in our democracies themselves, including in Germany, we have a growing divide and lack of common understanding on what is good and what is bad. So we need more democratic leaders or more democratic leadership, might be leaderless leadership in the sense of Banu, to take forward democracy and human rights. Fourth point, we have a very hope-providing, hope-evoking rise of powerful leaderless social movements with a lot of youth, girls, women playing a very, very important role, and the role of women cannot be underestimated in this context. Highly successful, hope-inspiring, however little effective, as we understand, but setting a powerful precedent, and they will be more and more important in the future, I'm sure. And the fifth point is the dilemma: how can small unities, how can leaderless unities survive in a world of wolves? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this rich introduction. I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss some of your assumptions in more detail later on. But now I would like to ask Banu to give her perspective, from the field of culture and arts and cultural policies.
Yeah, thanks, Pia, and thank you, Johannes. There's much to parse through in what you've raised. But I would like to perhaps come back to basics first, and one more time sort of invite us to think about what leaderless actually means, because it can mean different things in different contexts. I think the gender dimension that you raised at the end of your intervention, Johannes, is extremely important, because a lot of these, what we would say, newer forms of social movements or social organizing very often explicitly or increasingly explicitly also try to take on more feminist principles of what could, and ask the question, what could a more feminist, sometimes this is expressed in terms of inclusion, but let's say feminist, for now, feminist ways of leadership look like? What kinds of leadership models can we develop in contrast to the idea of the masculinist, patriarchal leader that is very much ingrained in a hierarchical in the state structure as it is normative today? So very often when we then say leaderless, what we actually want to say is that these are lateral movements that aim to be, at least they try to be non-hierarchical, that try to work through consensus building rather than top-down decision making, and that very often also try to include in their agendas explicitly anti-racist, anti-transphobic ways or ways of being, or non-discriminatory, very clearly non-discriminatory ways of coming together that also mean the dismantling of racist, of homophobic, of transphobic structures, of misogynistic structures that are very much try to divest from the kind of privileges that these structures bring. What we also often mean is different ways of accountability. When we say leaderless movements, different experiments in what transparency can mean, even in places where leaderless movements also have to shield themselves from, let's say, surveillance, for instance. And they're often understood as forms of organizing that are more open-ended. So where consensus building also means that the goals of such movements are still coming into being as people are getting together. So there are different ways of making community and making politics than we usually know it within the nation state context. And it's a little bit also that I read Isaac's manifesto in that way to invite us to think about how to fill these kind of ideas. At the same time, we could also ask, is the manifesto itself not also within the tradition of sort of masculinist move. On the one hand, it's a part of a tradition of a sort of emancipatory movements, but it's also a bit of a masculinist way of expressing, of course, certain political goals. I had the opportunity to read artist Metin Akdemir's Artist Manifesto recently, where he calls it a manifesto in flux, exactly to open up the form of the manifesto itself to more open-ended discussions. I also wonder, or I'm also very fascinated by what happens actually within when communities try to organize in leaderless ways under the current neoliberal or capitalist, late capitalist conditions. When we were preparing for today and I had a chance to talk with Isaac and Pia, I was reminded once again how under neoliberalism, the onus is always on the individual rather than on collectives, right? So we're supposed to be responsible for ourselves, and this is sort of marketed, and I say this quite consciously marketed to us as a sort of modern way of being. We are enterprising selves. Indeed, in the 2000s, it was a very sort of slogan, me Inc., me incorporated, sort of the idea, especially of people in the creative field, of the artist as entrepreneur, of the cultural worker as entrepreneur, that should have a person who should have an entrepreneurial spirit. And at the same time, what we see in this convergence of the neoliberal order within the nation state, or this capitalist order in the current nation state system, is that this takes off a lot of focus from the actual bodies that govern our lives, both and the corporate world, which has taken over so much, or which shapes our life on a daily basis, from the programs we use that we meet each other now, like Zoom, to Google and so on. And this has become increasingly clear during the COVID pandemic, where the question is, who is really leading the responses to the pandemic, and where in a lot of, here in Germany, but throughout Europe, there's been a lot of talk of self-responsibility, sort of the idea that it's the responsibility of individuals to protect themselves. But the pandemic condition is such that we are very much reliant on the fact that others protect us. The biggest example here being, of course, the wearing of the mask and the keeping of distance, for instance. So we are extremely dependent on the behavior of others, yet the current sort of order tells us that we're responsible for ourselves, and yet we live as a sort of life where no one is accountable for anything, it seems to me. So there is actually a certain leaderlessness in terms of taking accountability or responsibility for anything. I think it's by now an almost global phenomenon that, in any country of the world, the sentence is spoken, oh wow, a politician who resigns because they take responsibility for something they did is a rarity today, As we said, for instance, in the case of Germany, when the minister of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern resigned, when he resigned because he bought a personal weapon from a right-wing network. I'm foreshortening the discussion here, but and in Turkey we know this too. Oh, is there still a politician left who would even consider resigning because of a decision they have taken? Is a sort of sentence we hear very often. So this idea, I think, leadership and leadershipness, and this came also through in what Johannes said, is very closely tied also to issues of accountability and responsibility, and how that is distributed within social structures and communities. Maybe I should stop here. I also have some questions for Johannes, because he raised some excellent points, but maybe we can come back towards that, circle back towards the end.
As I said, I'm trying not to be so much of an authoritarian moderator today. So if you want, dear Banu, you can maybe ask your questions to Johannes directly.
I'm just, I think it's very interesting what you laid out for us, Johannes, from your perspective, also working within international diplomacy. Just maybe we can make it less questions, but just some points I want to raise, and then Johannes, you may answer, or sort of we can have a little back and forth about it now or later. I think what you say is very, with regard to the movements that have come up, I think, you know, it's also important that we keep in mind that they're not just spontaneous. Yes, there's a spontaneous element to it, but they, of course, when we look, the moment we look closer, we notice that the pillars of such movements are very often long, sometimes decades long of organizing practices that have preceded this sort of moment in which they become visible to us. And one issue here, for an example that probably most have been following internationally, when it comes, for instance, to Black Lives Matter, that was a movement that came up spontaneously, but what has come after it with an abolitionist perspective or for defunding and abolishing the police, that movement has built over decades, of course, through works with incarcerated people in disenfranchised communities and so on. I think we can give similar examples from Turkey during the Gezi protests, where yes, there was an element of spontaneity to it, but decades of LGBT organizing and feminist organizing really anchored, for instance, those, and Kurdish organizing, of course, anchored those protests in quite a different fashion. Perhaps that's sort of important to keep in mind. And I think one issue that was very important that Johannes raised, and that's not really not just to reiterate, the question here is very much about how state and society, how we think about state-society relations, right? What is the state? Who is the state? What is the state for? And how do those who the profession of administration and politics see themselves vis-a-vis their institutions, vis-a-vis the communities that organize around them, right? I think what we're really seeing is that a greater understanding, and we see this in the climate change movement very, very specifically, the idea that you can just elect someone who will then advocate on your behalf. I think everyone has understood that that kind of representational democracy is not working for disenfranchised communities at all. It is only through continual movement building and that kind of activism that anything seems to be moving in politics at this point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Banu. I would agree, fully agree on what you said. First of all, the main point that you have been underlining, and I think it is very, very important, this lack of responsibility, of being accountable for what you do, and even if a politician resigns, and if he's done a lot of mistakes and slandered and spoiled a lot of taxpayers' money, or worse, contributing to armed conflicts, to social strife, etc., it's nothing. I mean, what is his? In what really consists his kind of responsibility or his accountance for what he or she has done? So, and your example with our behavior in COVID-19, that we focus on, oh my God, why can't we go out? Why cannot we spend some holidays? Why can't we take to the mountains to ski in these beautiful winter days in Germany? I mean, this is typical, and this is a typical lack of responsibility. And we should much more focus on the collective, on the common good. And this is something, I think it's not being done by education also, because this is also by education, but not only through the schooling system. It's something that must be put at the core of our social discussion in a much stronger way on that. I fully agree. I would also agree on the social movement. Certainly, there is. I accentuated, or I made a particular emphasis on the spontaneous element. Why? Because we diplomats and we states and governments, we in in brackets, this is very often we are surprised by them. Why? Because we are not really listening to other societies or to what's going on. So we have to sharpen our ears and to be more aware of these movements. And Hong Kong also would provide a good example, because we had the umbrella movement in 2014, preceding the so-called Be Water movement in 2019, where up to 2 million people out of a population of 8.5 million took to the streets. Isaac can provide us, might be with very sur le vif impressions on that. So certainly there is a long time preparation, and certainly, of course, there are minds and spirits contributing and preparing it. So from nothing there is nothing. But then the way they organize is very horizontal, kind of very spontaneous in the reaction of things that are going on. Your last question on the state-society relation is very interesting. My question, or where I'm quite unsure, is as to whether a leaderless society would be possible within our nation state. And our nation state seems to be extremely resilient. He's already kind of 200 years old, dating back to the early 19th century.
Only, not already.
Only. Yeah, only. You can,
very successful for such a short time.
That's true, and even the United Nations or the European Union is organized on the basis of nation states. We have been striving for decades to establish such as a kind of pan-European public or media sphere. Even with the internet, with social media, we do not have it. We have of course, we have our national cultures and languages that we are proud of. We are proud of diversity. Nowadays, diversity is very, very important, of course. But even with speaking English, speaking French, speaking Turkish, etc., we are not able to establish a common, a joint kind of platform or sphere of decision-taking. This is why most of the cooperation or the integration we have in Europe is based on the intergovernmental cooperation, which is quite clumsy and where we have a lot of problems, as you know. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this topic of responsibility of the individual is very interesting indeed, especially with regard to the question of checks and balances within leadership-less movements, because they do not necessarily have to be fairer to every individual involved, I guess. Maybe sometimes they are, and I'm sure we will hear more about it also later on from you, Banu. Now I would first like to ask you, Johannes, working in diplomacy for several decades already, being a very experienced diplomat in different contexts, working for the Foreign Office, the embassy, the consulate, in governance. Those are really seemingly hierarchical places. So I would like to know from you what the meaning of leadership in this context is from your perspective, and which kind of leaderlessness or leadership contributes to successful diplomacy. Not only, but of course also in countries where you also been working, like China or Turkey, with, let's say, stronger state leadership systems.
Very, very difficult, very complex questions. I would say a good example where we need leadership is not leaders necessarily, but leadership is the European context. As I said, we have lots of European member states with different interests. When you look to the European policy vis-à-vis Turkey, you have different member states with different position and creating different challenges for coming to a joint approach and to make progress. So I think there leadership, and even though I would even say leaders, even persons matter. Look, I would choose prefer to choose a more kind of neutral example. Let's take the recent adoption of these unprecedented financial 150 billion of euros in December, called Next Generation EU, to help the member states overcome the economic and social consequences of the pandemic, and to make our societies, our economies more resilient, to prepare us for climate change, etc. It was very difficult to reach an agreement because we had a built-in a good governance or a rule of law clause opposed by some member states, and it took all the diplomatic skills and experience of some people. Okay, I praise our own leader, our chancellor in this context, who was instrumental to take that forward and to reach an agreement. But at the same time, we had numerous colleagues working in Brussels, working in Berlin, working in our friends in Paris and in Rome, in Madrid, in other places, to help us to forge that consensus on that important issue, namely to link financing with rule of law, because we all know without rule of law, with any corruption problem, for example, emerging, you would spend taxpayers' money, and you would violate the principle of responsibility and of being held accountable. So I think this is very, very important that we made that, and it's a small step, might be, but it cannot be overestimated. So on your second question, I think yes, on a small scale or even a medium scale, we have to be much more creative to invite more persons, more actors, more people, including, and Banu, you're completely right, this gender aspect is so important, including women, including children, including the elderly, including minorities, or I would say marginalized communities. I don't like the term minorities, and others, in order to take forward, for example, conflict resolution. We have so many conflicts where that I myself witnessed, where we have an agreement, a peace agreement, or an agreement of ending the hostilities just at the government level between foreign ministers or heads of state and government. But what is with all the people on the ground? What is with the mothers who have to take their children to school and then jumping on mines? What is with people whose livelihood is being threatened and destroyed? What is with minorities or minoritarian communities who are threatened by their neighbors because they feel more strong and they feel protected by a kind of authority? So I think it is key to be creative and to involve much more people on a much kind of basic level to take forward conflict resolution. And we are thinking about that for years already, but we have to do it in a much more sustainable and systematic way. Thank you.
Do you have like best practice examples for this? I'm sure the German state, especially in conflict resolution, often also works together with grassroots movements and like horizontal solidarity movements.
Yeah, at the moment I wouldn't have examples, but you are right. We were numerous NGOs, including in Turkey, in Syria, on issues such as migration, for example, on issues such as conflict resolution, on constitutional reform, and it is the bulk of the work, for example, for migrants, for Syrian migrants in Turkey, is being done by very good NGOs who are working with them on a very basic level, applying the principle that in order to take forward and to improve integration of migrants, you have to offer social programs that would also favor the population of the place where migrants arrive. So Turkish communities as well, in order to avoid any kind of strife or any competition or any conflicts between them. So this is, for example, this is something that recently is jeopardized because, according to studies made here in Ankara by researchers, showing that the relationship between people, between the local population and the newly arrived becomes more difficult, especially in these economically difficult times and in these COVID-19 times. It shows that we need to do much more to convince both, and to convince also the people who already live in the place to take care for migrants. That's only possible in supporting both. That's one example.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would now like to shift the focus to cultural policies specifically, and I would like to ask you, Banu, leaderless does not necessarily mean artistless or curatorless. I mean, this exhibition that most of you have probably seen wouldn't have been possible without the incredibly creative mind of Isaac, for example. So I would like to ask you, Banu, can a cultural or artistic production be successful without one leader? And if so, how? Maybe you have practical examples.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of going about answering that. Can I just backtrack 1 second before I come back to this? I think, what we should also highlight in this COVID crisis, and I think this goes for a lot of the examples we've already raised, and I think for others that we'll be raising as well. When I talk about individual responsibility, one part of it is also what Johannes took up, which is the question of what does this pandemic ask of each of us in terms of giving up certain things or adhering to rules that are for the benefit of the greater good, so to speak. But the other thing is that, of course, we have in many places, and this includes Germany and Turkey, even though, of course, the way in which the pandemic is sort of going is different, but this appeal to individual responsibility at the same time as the state is not willing, or the state structure is unable or not willing to protect exactly those populations who are being made structurally vulnerable. And that creates a kind of bifurcation that I think is now one of our biggest problems, and has also as making this pandemic go longer and longer than any of us would have wished for. But to come back to the more specific issues around how do we, how can we think about this in terms of artistic production, I think especially in the world of art and culture, there's always been experimentation that has, for instance, tried to circumvent, undermine, sabotage in a sort of creative way, the idea of the artist as author or artist as leader, or, with the rise of the curator, then again, the sort of idea of bringing curatorship as this leadership model within the art world down again. And, in Turkey, if we talk about Istanbul, for instance, I think many of us might remember the TIEF exhibition at Depot, Where Fire Strikes, I think was the English title, Ateşin Düştüğü Yer, where in 2011 that was a sort of crowdsourced. Of course, there were also people coordinating this exhibition, but it was a very open-ended exhibition where people could bring works to celebrate the anniversary of the foundation of the establishment of the Human Rights Foundation. Sometimes these kind of collective endeavors are to protect anonymity of artists. I'm thinking of the collective 19th January that was established after the assassination of Hrant Dink, and that did the exhibition Minferit, that collected and exhibited the names of the politically disappeared and people who had fallen prey to political violence and assassinations in the history of the Republic of Turkey, for instance. I know less that kind of example from the German context. I was thinking about that, but let's talk about Istanbul first. I'm also thinking about the solidarity events, some for one particular for Osman Kavala, the 72-hour shift Vardia that was organized as a sort of rolling 72 hours of collective production that took part at Depot to raise awareness around Osman Kavala's case and his continued detention, imprisonment. So I think there are these initiatives. This doesn't come to mean they're successful in terms of fulfilling all the hopes and dreams and principles they start out with and that they map, but they're aspirational in that they try to bring to life, to mobilize these kind of feminist principles, the kind from principles of a non-hierarchical coming together and organizing. But of course, they are always, when you do the oral histories of these events, they are always ridden with conflict. They are always difficult things to achieve, I think. Yeah, these come to mind at first.
And you know, who takes the responsibility in those leaderless movements? Who is doing the labor? We in the preparation of today, we also talked about the initiative Siaband. You're part of that. Maybe you could also give us some examples from your experience working for Siaband.
Yeah. You know, this is something, and Asena Günal is on this call, and our colleague Pelin Basharan. You know, when we established Siaband, which is a platform that researches and documents censorship in Turkey, the idea was at the beginning we would sort of kick this off, and we would sort of try and work on different principles of how to do this work on censorship and give, you know, like work on toolkits for artists and art students and people in the art, cultural workers, people in the art world. But we always thought we would build up Siaband as an umbrella, and then people on the local level could organize around this and take this umbrella of Siaband, which might also give them a certain kind of anonymity or a certain kind of protective layer to work with this. But that never really took off. And I think we've talked about this, our colleague Pelin Basharan isn't here, but you know, we've talked about different aspects of that, and we see this not as a failure of other people, but also of our failure to sort of be able, you know, to sort of share in the responsibility or get people to share in the responsibility for that. And I think that's also in part why we're thinking about how we can keep working in the field of arts freedom in a meaningful way, and in a way that opens up Siaband to really, for people to make it their own and say, you know, like, we need a local initiative here. We have a problem with this when it comes to art freedom in this town, in this city, or in this particular art space. But it's been difficult to, you know, to really get that going in a way and further that kind of way of organizing around a question like arts freedom and censorship.
Before, I would like to ask you some questions about like cultural polities on states' behalf in Turkey and in China. I would have one last question to you, Banu. In the field of arts and culture, and more specifically in its governance and cultural policy, a specific kind of leaderlessness is often claimed, also by art institutions like ours. Like I include Goethe Institute here. And sometimes, even in art institutions that have a program that is very unhierarchical, we have, I say that very openly, almost dictators at the top of those institutions, being the creative genius, but terrorizing the people who work there. what would you say about this, Banu? What is your opinion on that?
Let me start with the later point first. This is something we didn't talk about before, but I think, you know, in the realm of nonprofit arts organizations or non-governmental arts organizations, state organizations are a bit different, but you know, it's often said that it's sort of open, the sort of organizational structure and the idea that one is not profit oriented but goal oriented is a especially open field for charismatic leaders, and charismatic leadership has this kind of problem that you're talking about, that you then tend to terrorize. These are structures that are very amenable to terrorizing people you're working with, you know, all under the umbrella of we're doing something for the common good, in this case, in the field of arts and culture. Unfortunately, and I think this has something very much to do with the idea of what the non-profit working world is, and especially the art world is, because there is so much this understanding that we're all on the same side, that a lot of principles aren't even discussed. You know, of course, you know, everyone in the art world would say, oh, we're anti-racist, but what does that actually mean? Or we're not misogynist, but does that mean that women art workers are really protected? And we've seen how in recent weeks, again, in the academy, but also in the art world, women have raised their voices, not just women, even also men, around, for instance, sexual harassment as a tool of this kind of abuses of power. And we see this all the time. But when we come to cultural policy as a policy field, I think it's really, really interesting. What I was struck by in my research when I did interviews with cultural policy makers for the book is that among the many contradictions that cultural policy entails, it's always it's an area of policy where everyone says, we didn't make the policy, or we don't make the policy. We're just facilitating art and culture. And this is really interesting because it's similar in Germany and similar in Turkey as well. You know, in Turkey, cultural policy officials told me, we don't make cultural policy in that way. We don't shape culture because politics should not shape culture anyway. But you know, this kind of and what was really interesting is that one director of a strategic planning bureau within the Ministry for Culture and Tourism, for instance, said, and anyway, even if it hasn't changed since Turkey's cultural policy has not changed since 1950, which is sort of the transition to multi-party system, which I found very interesting. But the same was true for the Berlin Senate when I asked, so how do you, you know, how does your sort of the principles of your cultural political work come together, your cultural policies? They would always say, oh, we don't make the policies. The policies are in the reunification of Europe, or it was their predecessors who had put down certain principles, but it was never them. So it's very hard in the realm of cultural policy to find anyone who's responsible for anything, really. Although all these people are, of course, responsible for tons of things. In case of the Berlin Senate, for instance, they say, oh, you know, even the money is allocated for juries. Fine, but who chooses the juries, right? So in Germany, there's a more veiled kind of decision mechanism that is then delegated to juries. In Turkey, it's a little bit different because the funding for art, although, like, let's say in the realm of private theater and so on and so forth, is also related to juries. But when we think about contemporary art, because we're, you know, here together for Isaac's exhibition also, the funding is so minuscule that we often see the state only appearing when it brings in restrictive measures rather than funding measures. Although, you know, I always say that non-funding is, of course, also always a policy preference that is much harder to discern, I think. But generally, I think this is quite interesting, this idea that those who are cultural policy makers tend to say they don't really make cultural policy. Others make it and they just sort of facilitate it. And also, I think that in part, this is, I think, one reason for this is also that there's, of course, always a discomfort around the marriage of art and administration, sort of positions that you know very well, Pia. But my sense, and I always like to quote Adorno on this, that without administration, without the state involvement, it's sort of the idea of the autonomy of art does not mean that the state is not there to support art. Quite to the contrary, that the state apparatus and its institutions are very important through its museums, through arts education in schools, are a very, very important factor in building audiences for art. Right. So we shouldn't, and I think this is often something what we forget in Turkey, where we're like, oh, better the state doesn't get involved at all. No, we are in need of these administrative structures in the absence of other things to provide the audiences, from education to transportation. How do you get to a museum? How do you even get to an arts venue? How much does it cost you? All these questions, we used to think about them together in the 70s. I think we do less so today. And I think there, a lot of the discussion around leadership gets lost between these different aspects and discomforts when it comes to the issue of art.
How is that in China? I would be very interested in your experience. Johannes, you spent 4 years there. How led is the cultural policy there? As far as I know, compared to Turkey, of course, there is also state control, but there is also a lot of money that is being invested in order to make artists contribute, as the state president said in his opening speech about his cultural policy when he came to power, to contribute to the harmonization of society. That this is the artist's task, and that is why China put so much money and efforts into culture and arts. How was your experience? Being a German diplomat also, I would of course also be interested in the foreign cultural policy. I know that China has hundreds of Confucius institutes around the world.
Yeah, thank you, Pia. First of all, I would say, Banu, your response was so comprehensive and so important. What you were saying, that it's provoked a lot of thoughts in my head. What we have to do in order to reveal our kind of hidden agendas and intentions, because of course, a cultural policy is a contradictio in adjecto, is a contradiction in itself, because at least in the best of all worlds, culture should be kind of authority-free, should be really a leaderless space where free artists can associate and create something new, even without any intention or without any specific purpose, without any kind of, coming back to China, cultural revolution or so agenda in mind. But we always have something in mind. And I fully agree also on what you said on charismatic leaders and Pia's kind of dictators in some institutions. Even though I wouldn't try to be not more specific. And this leads me to a key phrase in the manifesto that I have under my eyes. I think 2 or 3 very important sentences on the problematic side of charismatic leadership, because charismatic leaders, they are very strong, they are populists, and they reject any control, they reject any accountability, because they are so great and they kind of communicate directly with the people. And here Isaac's manifesto says, and I thank him for that, we believe in no hero. We refuse to idolize the image of a leader. We are not superstitious. We don't believe that a hero exists. We don't worship any leaders, with the kind of focus on worship. So I think that's a very important statement. Now coming, and thank you, Banu, for your thought-provoking thoughts, and I have to read, I think, your whole book. On China, Pia, you anticipated a little bit my response. Of course, in particular under the China's current leader, Xi Jinping, who is becoming more and more Mao-style leader of the country. We have a highly centralized cultural policy driven by the Politburo and the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. in the definition of Xi Jinping, and he explicitly follows Mao Zedong, the art follows a clear political purpose. So there is never a purposeless art. This is why alternative artists or writers are being kind of prosecuted and put into prison. There is a senior, for example, senior Chinese writer, woman, Fang Fang, who wrote the so-called Wuhan diary, and on the 167 or so days of the total crackdown on Wuhan that was brutally enforced by the authorities there, now being presented by China, including in the Confucius Institutes, as a glorious examples. Oh, we protect lives under the benevolent and glorious rule of the Communist Party, and what happens in your countries, what happens in Europe, what happens in Turkey, and what happens in the US, people are killed in your so-called democratic systems. And she reveals the way, by very normal observations, day-to-day life, she wrote down what she witnessed. And now she's being marginalized and being criticized and being even criminalized by the state. So the culture very clearly serves to implement the so-called Chinese dream, the Chungwo Meng for China and the mankind, with an allegedly shared future for the mankind, alive in harmony under, of course, the benevolent surveillance and rule of the Communist Party, which means an instrumentalization and ideologization of cultural policy that goes so far that the Chinese history, including the Uyghurs and Xinjiang, are kind of redefined, and a Chinese history is invented that spans 4,000 or 5,000 years back, including Western China and the Turkish-speaking part of China, and particularly Xinjiang, which is prone to, I would say, manipulation of the history. And this is the point that I would make. We have not only in China, but unfortunately also in my country and in Turkey. And this is something where we should be much more critical and be aware, because this is a kind of characterizing and determining what most people now understand of history, which is not true. There is no great continuity. There are more contradictions in history. There's might be even more bad than good in history, and we have to reveal this, and we have to be much more critical and try to improve kind of our ways and means. And this is why art is so important, because art is also something, good art, that would put the fingers in the wound here.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your important insights. I would now like to open the discussion also to the audience. Do you have questions for Banu or for Johannes? You can either write them in the chat or speak directly. No one? Asena.
Hello. Thanks a lot for the presentations. I'm really curious about Isaac's work. I missed the performance, but I would like to come and see the exhibition. I wanted to thank Banu for citing two examples from Depot. One is this, where fire has struck, where the artists came together to commemorate the 20th anniversary of Turkish Human Rights Foundation. It was a voluntary and collective effort of 131 artists. But let me say that it wasn't easy. And when you look behind what's going on in such collective efforts, there were too many fights and there were too many tensions. I remember a moment when artists were in tension and Osman Bey got in and artists were complaining to him about each other, and he was like listening to them calmly. And in the end, there was a fight, and it was very much based on the masculinity of the artist involved. In the end, the catalog of the exhibition could not be published because of those tensions. So I mean, it can be seen and very nice from outside, but they all require, there might be some negative sides, and there are people who work harder. Actually, this was my point. I mean, when it comes to work and leadership balance, it's always a bit tricky. I was in a feminist organization, and in that feminist organization, the aim was to have, not a vertical hierarchy, but rather a horizontal, functioning. But then you realize that many of the tasks are realized by certain people. Certain people are taking responsibility and doing the works. And when you do the work, you feel like you have a more saying because you're putting too much effort. And then some other people are saying, we shouldn't do it like that. We shouldn't. Okay, do it then. Yeah, you're not doing it, but you're, talking about it. So this was the main problem. And I always remember a saying of one of our members. She said, being lonely is easier compared to being in an organization, being organized. It was true. Or being organized and being in a feminist organization, which claims to have a, not hierarchical order, was really hard. So, I would like to ask this to Banu. What do you think about this work, division of labor, and hierarchy thing? Yeah. And this is something that we can talk about for the cultural institutions too. The responsibility, the workload, and leadership.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this up, Asena. I think also that the labor that is involved in horizontal kinds of organizing is immense, because you're exactly, it's not clear, and it has to be distributed in a very different way than in a hierarchical organization. And actually, you have in some ways through your examples also answered it much more beautifully than I could, sort of in an abstract way, because I think this is exactly the crux of what we find also very often in the art world, and why the art world, organized in the non-profit sense, still is open to this kind of charismatic leadership, because, as you say, this kind of horizontal organizing, the more consensus-based, the distribution of responsibilities and tasks according to capacities, that individuals have. And, and that's also why labor is so important. The hidden labor, especially by women in these kind of movements and in that field of arts and culture, is immense. And when we think about under capitalism, labor means money. Yeah, and who gets paid and who doesn't get paid, who gets paid what. These continue to be things that haunt us in the world of arts and culture, despite our good intentions and despite all principles. And I think the examples you talked about are very, very important in that way. And also, who has even the opportunity to be part of more leaderless kind of configurations. It also means that you have to free yourself up from certain kind of subsistence strategies. You might have to have a certain kind of financial security to even be able to be active, to invest into certain kind of activities, because that part of your day is not spent on earning money, to put it quite banally. So I think you have really brought up excellent examples, and I always remember that quote that you talked about, that being alone is easy, being organized is a lot of hard work. It is really true. And according to these kind of principles, if you just want to make any kind of hierarchical organization, it's not that hard. It's not nice, but it's not that hard,
Thank you very much. Evrim wrote a question into the chat. Would you like me to read it, Evrim, or would you like to read it yourself? Okay. Hi, I would like to ask the timing of the need on taking a leadership in cultural diplomacy and international arts agenda. Which side are the artists and cultural diplomats, intellectuals are much belong to taking the responsibility on changing the public agenda? So the shortest version of my question is, when should one or some community should have the opportunity to taking the responsibility of change or create? So the question of timing, if I understand you correctly, because of the speed of communication, things become so much urgent and not at the time with the surprise effect of global pandemic, of course. So the question is open to all of us. Yeah. Banu, Johannes.
Evrim, I'm not sure I quite understood your question. Do you think you can? I think you have something quite specific in mind. I'm just not catching up to it. Would you mind explaining a little bit?
That would indeed be helpful.
In anything.
I think Evrim is typing. Maybe he has a problem with his microphone. Uncertainty is very powerful on these times. So if I understand correctly, the question of uncertainty, especially now in the time of the pandemic, and the question of timing when the individual should take responsibility to change and create.
I'm very full. That's a topic that is, but beyond the art world is sort of on my mind and has been on my mind for the past 12 months, to be honest. I mean, it's a difficult one because it's very interesting how we're seeing that during COVID times, some kinds of leadership that we used to rely on or think at least they're there, good or bad, have basically dissipated. They're nowhere to be found, you know. So that's very difficult. And I think in the world of arts and culture, I'd be more interested to hear what you think, Evrim. But just as a side note, or maybe this is also one of the parts that you're thinking about, you know, I think the pressure on arts institutions, for instance, to very, very early in the pandemic, to move everything online, to be active, to keep programming, you know, to not stop. In one sense, it's been very good and very, very valuable. In another sense, I wondered about this, especially in March, April, May, where I was like, will we ever have time to just stop and think what is actually going on? And I'm not saying that it's not valuable, it's extremely valuable. It's wonderful that we can be together here today, right? Through this, seeing each other in these little rectangles. But in some ways, I do wonder if, what that means that we couldn't even stop, that it had to keep going and going, you know, and the pressure that also made in the art world among institutions on artists. I wonder about that as well. But I don't know how Johannes would see it from a perspective of, you know, state actors.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think we were all taken by surprise. We all underestimated the impact of the pandemic. I was in China when it broke out, and we went to Wuhan to take care for German citizens. End of January, beginning of February, to evacuate them. We sent a plane to evacuate German and German-Chinese citizens and their relatives, and also bringing some medical aid and masks. And a couple of weeks later, it fully broke out in Europe, and we witnessed how badly we were prepared. And still, it's a learning by doing. It's an exercise where we witness a lot of failures currently, even now, and new challenges coming up. And once you think there's a glimpse of hope and there is a vaccine, then you have a new virus mutation with new kind of unknown aspects. And slowly, we all realize that might be the world that we had before 2019. Might be in a Stefan Zweig meaning, even the old world before 1914, never comes back. And now the world before 2019 might be never fully come back. And we always have to be aware of a risk that we, at least in the forthcoming years, in the next years, will not be able to completely cope with. And I fully understand the feeling that of being left alone by the authorities, by states, by leaders. Now we come to the kind of complex dimension of leadership, telling you, taking you by the hand and telling you, giving you, providing you with the right direction, providing you with the financial funds to survive the problems. Last but not least, I myself, I'm not an artist, but I love music for it. I love classical music, in particular in my generation. And what I really terribly lack is going to a concert at least once per week and to listen to music together with my wife and to have these meditative, contemplative moments. It's so okay. I mean, the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, and here in Istanbul, you have so great musicians. We produced a couple of virtual Beethoven concerts. They are on our social media of the General Consulate, and you're welcome to take a look into them. And we would like to continue that, but it's a very, very, very weak kind of surrogate replacement of a really live.
Thank you very much. Evrim, he added, agendas and projects are very uncertain. So is this a chance to change our paradigms, like a revolution on minds, etc.? I think you've already answered this kind of. If I may add to this, also from the perspective of Goethe Institute, yes, I think it should be actually the moment to change our paradigms, but very often, and I think it's the case for all art institutions especially, we're so stuck running in our hamster wheel because the work somehow is not really getting less. It's in any case the case for us. A few weeks ago, that is maybe interesting to tell, I had an encounter with our Secretary General. He invited 10 people from Goethe Institute all over the world to review the Corona time and also to get our advice on how we should in the future deal with it. And what I actually proposed, I have no idea if this will ever happen, but I said we need a moment without administrative work, without creating new projects all the time. Give us just one work week, 5 days, just to reflect on what happened to us actually. And I'm sure that on the long run, this will be very productive for the Goethe Institute. He took this note down. We will see what will happen to it. And one last remark also on your question, Evrim. I have heard several times that it was claimed that hierarchies have flattened due to Corona within art institutions. I don't really agree. I think it's really like a very superficial point of view that maybe in Zoom conferences we all look equal because we have the same frame, the same size, etc. I think it's really like a social disillusion, and that global inequalities have rather gotten worse. Okay, are there any more questions from the audience? Yeah, Isaac, you're very welcome to contribute.
Thank you very much, Pia, Banu, and Johannes. It has been a really fruitful and interesting talk for me to continue thinking about the idea of leaderless or the idea of leader and what would be a dialectic approach to maybe look for the truth. And I think I wouldn't repeat much of what you have said, but I was very interested when you mentioned about structurally vulnerable, like groups that are structurally vulnerable and how the state is producing it, or maybe it's not the state which is producing it, but how everyone agree on like producing a vulnerable group. And my question would be open to you all, like for example, from Johannes, what would be the state, like, because we're talking about structurally vulnerable, and the states definitely play part of it. like how these vulnerable groups of people are being formed or like being able to be existing, and how the state would tackle or change like this kinds of phenomenon that we are seeing. And if it's not from the perspective of the state, like how would we in general, I mean, we is always a difficult word because it's always like go to here or there, but like as a citizen or as a cultural worker, and how would we be able to change it? Or maybe if we cannot change the system itself, how do we tackle it? Is there any way? So that catches my my attention, and especially when we are thinking about lots of things that are given for granted, like it should be like that. We would say, of course, there should be vulnerable groups, and but why? Like I think in the talk you discuss a lot about like what we normally perceive, like we think that leadership or leader is natural, but is it really natural? Like is actually not natural if we look at the forests, for example. So if you would have any comments, or if you want to add anything about how structurally vulnerable are being constituted, it would be great.
Johannes, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. But Isaac, I don't understand your question, how vulnerable groups are being constituted, or how they are being addressed or supported. What is your understanding of being constituted? Could you be a little bit more?
For me, it's more like the birth of vulnerable groups. Like, why do we have vulnerable groups? Or is it a way by structuring a different society that we can avoid it? Or maybe this is a doom that we cannot avoid it? And my question would be like, when we're looking at the vulnerable groups, is it possible for the state to look at, instead of giving money, or like we talk about how the state is funding and providing people their need, but how do the state would be able to look at its own structure by tackling and changing the structure in order to prevent the birth of vulnerable groups?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very difficult question. I don't have an answer. Very difficult to imagine a completely free, wealthy society. Might be in Paleolithic times, or in a future world, or in a kind of utopia where you would not have discrimination, where you would have not the kind of the right, the rule of where you would have the rule of law and not the rule of the stronger, fighting and kind of discriminating the other. Very, very difficult to imagine. My thesis would be that this the existence of vulnerable, of weaker groups has something to do with the nature of mankind itself. And it leads me to almost, metaphysical or religious dimensions with, for example, Christianity, but also Islam, supposing a kind of the man as a sinner, as something who has something bad and egoistic into mind. But also a good side, and there's a struggle of the good and the evil in each and every body of us. So that is that leads me to very deep and fundamental issues here. I think the societies or groups or associations of men, of women, of people, they have to be aware of these inequalities, of the fact that there are structurally vulnerable groups, and they have to address them, and they have to make sure to be as inclusive as possible. We are all there in a learning procedure, and I think we are very much in the beginning. We haven't made a lot of progress so far. We are responsible to take care of the vulnerable groups and have to include these vulnerable groups into the leadership, into the governance of our societies. There's one interesting thing, for example, in the city of Berlin, Banu, you might know it, there's a decision taken by the Berlin Senate to make sure that the newly employed civil servants of Berlin represent the diversity of Berlin, represent migration, represent gender, represent vulnerable groups. So everybody has to be represented, of course, on the basis of qualification, which goes without saying. And I think this is possible, and we have to be much more strict in providing much more efforts to do this. We are trying the same in the German Foreign Office, but without being very successful so far. When you look to the number of, for example, female heads of missions or people of color in our service, there's still a lot of work to do, and it's still open as to whether we will be successful.
Yeah, Banu, maybe very briefly, as we're really running out of time.
Yeah. Thank you guys for your patience. I just want to very briefly say, I think, Isaac, what you're pointing at is that the state structure, the way we conceive of and are used to states as of today, produce vulnerability in a certain way, right? Guillaume Pandey, in his book Routine Violence, talks about how one of the functions of the nation state that is often hidden is the production of minorities and majorities, actually. So, and thus asymmetric power relations. And what Johannes described, the discussion, and it wasn't an easy discussion, and it was a very, very hard, we heard quite horrible things once more with the discussion around inclusion and what inclusion means. But inclusion will always only have a limited effect if the structures remain the same. It has to be the structures that produce this kind of inequality and vulnerability that have to be addressed ultimately, because otherwise the inclusion of vulnerable, of marginalized groups into already existing structures without changing the structure is not going to do much. We know this already. So the question remains how to address that equitably, justly in the future.
Yeah, we're running out of time, as I said. Thank you so much, especially to our two speakers, for your, I think for all of us, thought-provoking input. I would like to announce the next panel the next and the last panel in the series of podiums that will take place tomorrow, again at 4 p.m. With Gündüz Vassaf and Evrim Altuğ. The death and birth of leaderlessness is the topic. Thank you also to the audience for your patience and for your interesting questions. And I hope to see you in real life again soon at some point. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was lovely to see everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.